quantum computers. This is Intelligent Performance.
Welcome to the Intelligent Performance Podcast. An absolute pleasure to welcome Igrani you onto the show. Igrani, welcome. Thanks for being here and joining us from beautiful Tasmania on what is probably a lovely kind of summer morning or kind of spring morning down there. I'm imagining anyway.
You might want to tell the weather that, Michael. It feels like fall today. It's a bit of cloud, maybe a bit of rain.
Don't kill the dream. Don't kill the dream.
It's beautiful and sunny, and there are dolphins in the river. Yes, it's beautiful.
On behalf of the Tourism Board of Tasmania, I think it is beautiful down there. It's a gorgeous part of Australia. I think it's one of my favourite, actually, where we've only spent a bit of time down there, but it's for what I saw, it was just absolutely stunning. So anyway, enough of the advert for tourism. If you fancy sponsoring the show, Tourism Hobart, let us know. But Igrani, first of all, welcome. It's great to have you here. And for those who don't know a bit about yourself, I'll just do a short intro, but I might pass the mic then to you to fill in some of the gaps, because you've got a really interesting background, a trained chemist. You've become a chocolate expert. You've done a range of different businesses, and now you spend your time getting to understand the problems that customers have for these really complex, and some like people would call them boring, but the things like the risk, the insurance sector, these types of things, which they are boring, but they're also like super helpful and important, and really really important that we utilize these things. So I'm really curious, how would you kind of summarize your background, Igrani, to the layperson, should we say?
Well, I like to say that I've taken the scenic route in my career, Michael. So okay. I think I'm on career number 7. And right. I think it's interesting because there are a couple ways to tell that story. And I used to say, I'm easily distracted. But I've spun that around, and I'd like to say I'm endlessly curious. So I actually started in music. I was a piano teacher, was my very first job. I studied chemistry in university, got into the lab and realized, I actually don't want to be a chemist. I like chemistry on paper, but not in practice. I was an event planner. I was a pastry chef. I was a chocolate expert. I was a journalist. And what that really taught me was to be able to pivot really quickly, to jump into something with that beginner's mindset and be able to learn really quickly. I mean, some of those things are really complex. As a chemist, I was learning like an entirely different language, basically, really complex, lots of data points. And figuring out how to explain that in many cases to other people. As a journalist, I interviewed a lot of people. I learned how to tease out a story from almost anything. I like to say I can find a story in a shoebox. And now I work in this space where I develop white papers, often very much research-based. And for anybody who's not familiar with what a white paper is, it's a long-form document. It could be a PDF, it could be on a web page, but it's generally, say like 10 to 15 pages, possibly longer. And it gets really deeply into a problem, a business problem, and how a business would solve it, basically. And it is a piece of marketing, but it's not salesy. It's really coming from an educational perspective. Like, let me help you understand the way that we think, the way that we solve problems. And in order to do that, I sort of roll up all of these previous experiences that seem like they're really disparate, but like I'm dealing with data all the time. I'm explaining really complex things. I'm telling stories, because you can't just throw a bunch of data at people and expect them to get it. There's got to be some human or deep behavioral psychology to it to get a message across. And I also have training in marketing. So then I wrap all of that and I tie it back to business strategies. What is it that you're actually trying to achieve? So in a funny way, this sort of windy career path has really equipped me really well for what I'm doing today, although that was not the plan at any point, but it makes sense in the rear view.
Absolutely. Well, I think it can feel a little bit maybe discombobulated for those of us who don't follow a natural, quote unquote, career path, a GP or a surgeon or a mechanic or something like that. That can be well prescribed. And I think for those who don't kind of fit into those kind of grooves, should we say, finding your way can be a little, different. So no, I think in terms of today's conversation, very, very helpful for kind of helping to find we often talk about in this show, like the 5%, so intelligent performance, of course, the name of this podcast. And I'm curious, we ask all of our guests this, Igrani, what would be your take on intelligent performance? How would you define that kind of phrase?
It's a good question. I mean, there's two pieces to that, right? If we start with performance, right? Like, how do you perform to your best ability? If you think about like a race car, for example, you think about performance. Or if I think about people, like high performing people who get a lot done, who get the right things done. So that's a piece of it. But the intelligent part, I think, implies a thoughtfulness or an ability to connect different pieces, not necessarily the obvious pieces, to allow you to do that in a more, thoughtful, different, strategic kind of way. Like, you're not performing for the sake of performing. You're doing it with a lot of thought behind it. And I think that, to me, is what intelligent performance is. And drawing upon, intelligence makes me think of AI, for example, and drawing from all of the resources that you have available, whether that's human intelligence, artificial intelligence, technology, ancient intelligence. Like, people often ask, like, oh, how do I become a better writer, marketer, whatever? And a lot of it, like, I spend a lot of time reading old books, I'm going to be honest, because there's so much there that we as a human race have already figured out, and it's just there to be mined. So so I think it's those two pieces of it.
I completely agree with that last bit in particular. I think I'm not sure, with the advent of the mobile phone or the quote unquote smartphone, the users have become somewhat dumber, I think, in many ways. Although we've become perhaps ignorant of the wisdom that exists outside of the internet, or a quick summary, which, I think there's a lot to be said for the knowledge which exists, right? And then consuming it in a traditional format rather than, this app, tells me what this book is in, 30 seconds. And it's like, kind of handy, kind of.
Yeah.
But it really kind of overlooks perhaps the other part to it, where we used to prioritize spending time to develop wisdom and taking time to read. So just on that piece, actually, I'm curious when you've done that historical look at books, where do you kind of, when you say older books, what are you talking about? Are you talking about, we're talking about biblical texts? Are you talking about, things like that? Or are you talking more like, 1900s kind of, the man's search for meaning, that kind of stuff? What's your take on it?
All of the above, I guess. I'm trying to make a practice of reading books that were published kind of like 1970s possibly and before. And actually I started because there's an American author called Shirley Jackson, who I love. She's really famous for writing this short story called The Lottery, which was published in the New Yorker. I won't spoil it for anybody who hasn't read it, but it was shocking at the time, this story. Right. And I started digging into her, and I realized, like, I loved her short stories. I loved her novels. And then I started digging into, like, okay, well, who does Shirley Jackson really like? And so I went back a step, and she really drew a lot from Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter. And then so you take it a step further. Okay, well, who did Nathaniel Hawthorne really like? And you start going back in time to who really inspired the people that inspire you. And it's taken me, it's sort of broadened out from then. My husband got a copy of the Odyssey, a recent translation of the Odyssey for Christmas last year. And that's been on my list. And then in similar vein, like, our daughter is really into Greek mythology right now. So we talk a lot about, like, Sisyphus and Hercules, and those are some of the oldest stories that there are. So I'm pretty promiscuous as a reader, I will say. Like, I will read almost anything, and the thing that I really enjoy about it is I have read Man's Search for Meaning, and is an amazing book for anybody who hasn't read it. Really, really inspiring. I just lost my train of thought.
I think you've nailed it. I think you kind of spoken to the point there in terms of, it sounds like you're starting to see the wisdom or in variety, right? Which also speaks to your career, right?
Sure.
And I think there is a richness which I think can be lost in. I don't know what your take on this, and perhaps we're kind of getting a little bit off the point here, but there's the theory of scientific management has a lot to answer for. Like, it's this kind of thing which emerged in the late 1900s. It then kind of propagated everywhere. Like, it became the thing. Like, oh yes, of course, there must be a best way of doing anything, and we must find the quickest, the most productive. And productivity was classed as like this kind of mecca. And we've all become these kind of productivity junkies. Like it's now, God forbid you waste time. God forbid you spend, you're not getting as much as you possibly can, done. And imagine just taking your time out to go slowly in life, to think and be methodical. But no. It's all about output. And I think that I had a philosopher on here recently who kind of talks about like, that's a philosophy in itself, right? Which we don't realize that we've been taught in, or that we're even existing in this domain, and that this isn't necessarily the way to do things. And that's kind of, I think, what you're alluding to.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the other thing is like, we feel like a lot of the issues that are going on right now, we feel like they're new. Like they're so novel, they're so new. Nobody's ever come across these things before. And the thing is, when you read older books, I mean, the specifics of the issue, or they're not talking about AI or whatever, but they're talking about technology, or they're talking about anxiety, about change, or whatever it happens to be. And you read those books and you think, oh, I'm not so special. Like, we've encountered this before. We've solved this before. We've also made a lot of mistakes, and maybe we don't want to make those ones again. This worked, this didn't. Like, there is so much. I think it's really humbling to read old things, because you recognize, it forces me to recognize that, this is not new. This is not new. This is the human experience. It's just a different flavor of it.
I love that. And let's talk to that human experience piece. So in terms of what you do these days, you specialize in creating white papers for, you used the word before we jumped on, boring industries, but I think perhaps not great branding for the market you're trying to sell into. So we'll call it perhaps maybe traditional, perhaps kind of like, large scale industries. Perhaps they're difficult to, I think what you're talking about, and maybe you can speak to this, is the commoditization, right? So insurance as an example, from what I understand of insurance, like I was on a plane recently, I ended up talking next to this, a guy who buys brokers. He works for a private equity firm, and he was on the hunt for different brokerages. And I was just like, how does it work? And essentially there's like three main insurers across the planet, from what I understand, or there's only a handful. And then everyone kind of sprouts like that. So you might insure over here, but ultimately you're insured back in, Lloyd's of London or something like that. So tell me, in terms of that commoditization, that kind of similarity, perhaps also complexity, like, this insurance is really good if you're a farmer with X hundreds of hectares, but it's not very good if you've got a small hobby farm, something like that. How do you find the nuance in these kind of complex, and even how do you make them compelling? How do you find the story in something which is so, to use your words, dry?
Yeah, it's a good question. So just to be clear, I work sort of in the layer above the actual insurance company. So I work for companies who sell the software that an insurance company would use. So the equivalent might be like Microsoft, right? Like everybody uses Microsoft, but you might sell Microsoft to healthcare versus teachers versus whatever. So I'm kind of like the Microsoft level of insurance. So it's insurance technology or insurance software, right? Okay. But I mean, to your point,
a new level of boring.
I know. Like, you're not even talking to like a human buyer there are human buyers, of course, pardon me, but like, you're not talking to the end user. You're talking to typically like a head of underwriting, or possibly like a chief technology officer. So I mean, on some level, all of these things are very, very similar. And the thing that makes it different often is the company will have a specific point of view. So they'll have a certain way of solving this problem, like this standard industry problem, but they're going to have a slightly different way of solving it. There's going to be some perspective within the company, either in the way that they developed the product or in the way they service and fulfill the product. And those are the human elements that are really important to pull out, because I mean, it depends. Like, ultimately, if we're talking about typically an enterprise buyer, they are going to lean towards certain types of companies. So it's about knowing your customer and knowing like how do they make a buying decision, and how do I make them want to buy what I'm selling, right? It's not I want to sell you something, but like, what do you want to buy? Okay, how do I Tetris those two things together? And I mean, it sounds funny. Like, I don't know that there are any truly commoditized products because there's always going to be some small nuance to the way that you operate. You're going to be better in certain industries. You're going to be able to serve different companies better, depending on who their end users are. There's going to be funny little quirks like that.
Yep.
And a lot of it is about, do you know your audience? Do you know yourself? Do you know your capabilities? And are you able to actually align those things? That's the really hard part. That's the really hard part.
I guess the commoditization piece, it's a really good point you made. I think is perhaps I'm referring to the commoditization which happens in the customer's head more than anything.
Yeah.
Right? Because
yes,
in my business that we run, we get pulled into the leadership development space, right? We specialize in first-time leaders in construction and infrastructure, whereas most people in the leadership game of like they're either broad brushstrokes or they focus on executive. So, but over the other side, it's like, well, you're all just the same. Like a builder, if you're buying a house, you're like, they all just build, like I just don't really care. And like, or they're all just estate agents, So I think maybe is it that's what you're referring to. How do you kind of break through that piece to have your client understand something? So yeah, talk us through that bit. So let's say you are working in this commoditized, let's say you're selling into an insurance software company who kind of helps streamline the underwriting process, or forgive me, you'll know better than I do. Yeah. But let's just say we're in that space. So how are you getting the attention of the insurance underwriter or the CTO or the CIO perhaps in that context? How are you framing this quote unquote problem? Are you doing is it like a typical clickbait style Facebook ad where you're like, top 10 things CDOs get wrong in insurance or something? Or it sounds like it would be a bit more sophisticated.
Well, so the funny thing with the insurance industry is, as you said, it's very small, like ultimately, like compared to, I think, many other industries. Right. And I could be wrong, but there's a fairly well-defined pool of customers. And so there are a couple of advantages. So one is if you have an advantage if you already have a relationship with some of those customers. So in my experience, I mean, there's kind of two ways of doing it. Is you tend to be like a fairly large company who sells multiple products into the insurance space. And so they already know you. Or you can be like a tiny little startup and you're very good at one particular thing and you have like one very special piece of technology. I think those are probably they're very clearly two different paths to business and paths to business, to growth. But I think where you have the advantages in really understanding that customer and what their needs are. And each product is going to have certain differentiators. So for example, without giving too much away, I'm working with a company right now who's launching a new product. They have built certain differentiators into the product that they know are really, really important. And one of the things that we're working on is that their market doesn't understand why those things are important. And so that's really where a lot of thoughtful and strategic content comes in, is when you look at, okay, what's the conversation we would like to have with somebody? Well, we'd like to say we built this thing, is different because of X, Y, and Z. However, if you can recognize, okay, our customers don't understand why that's important. So in their head, this product is a commodity product because they don't understand the value of those differentiators. Okay, well then how do we develop content to illustrate why X, Y, and Z is important? What might those types of content be? How can we put those pieces of content in front of the audience, both like when we are actually speaking to them, if we have a relationship with them, or in a place where they can bump up against it. Maybe we're going to events, maybe we're sponsoring a webinar, maybe it's paid social, whatever it happens to be, right? The actual channels are less important to me than being thoughtful about where are the gaps in the conversation where our message is not landing in the way that it should be, and how do we need to educate our customer so that those conversations aren't stopping points, they're starting points.
Interesting. I think that's it's a tricky challenge, right? Because a lot of these, especially in these sectors, what I see, and maybe your experience is different, that you get someone who's worked in this insurance space for 20, 30 years, and then they pop out and they go, it's time for me to build my own business, and they've built something super nichey, which only if you've had 20 years experience in doing that really makes any sense. And then and trying to communicate anything when you've done 20, 30 years of it in a way which can be picked up by a layperson is a real skill in itself, right?
Yep.
So how do you work or how do you help people? 'Cause I'm curious for people listening to this is like, okay, well, what could they apply themselves or how could they start to think the problem that they're addressing and how, if they're in that boat, as it were, how do they start to tease out the message which resonates? How do you even kind of test to evaluate if you're so in the woods, you can't see the trees, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. And at the risk of sounding self-serving, I really think an outside party is beneficial. So you can, for example, it might be a messaging expert. It might be, sometimes it's branding, like it depends how big or small you are, but often messaging is a big gap that I see. People have a product, they have an audience, but they don't know, there's a bridge, right? The message is the bridge from here's what we offer to here's why it's important and relevant for you. And if you don't have the right messaging, it's not landing properly, right? They're just not going to get it. So often working with a third party is really helpful. And if you have the right person, they're going to ask you tons and tons of questions. They're going to ask you, they're going to force you to do audience research. They're going to look at all of your communications. They're going to want the analytics. They're going to talk to you about like, how are you going to market? Like why is this important? Why is that important? What kinds of conversations have you been having? What are the questions that you get? What are the objections? Like you, it's really challenging when you know the topic so well. There's so many assumptions baked into that, and it makes it really, really difficult to even begin to put yourself in the customer's shoes to understand what they don't know, what they do need to know, what they don't need to know. Like that's the other thing is I think sometimes when you are the person building it or when you have so much experience, you're like, oh, well, we did this thing and we did X and blah, 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 blah. And you are so excited about it and you are so expert in it. It's like sculpting. Like you can't give somebody a block of marble, you have to give them the sculpture. And a lot of the art of it is actually being like, nope, don't need that. Don't need that. Oh, that's really good. We're going to keep that. And it's not that you can't do it internally. It's that you're too close to it. And depending on the culture within your company, you may not have a culture in which you have a process by which you are doing that paring back, or you may not have a space where people feel that they can say those things. You may not have just even like the opportunity to be like, oh, like we had the sales conversation the other day and we tried to talk about this, but they wanted to talk about this. And they had the question, like, how are you actually collecting all of these things? And when you're actually building the thing, you're so busy building it that it's really difficult to create that space to actually say, wait, that's interesting. Like, what do we do about that? And so bringing on typically like a messaging expert, I would say, is really helpful. Sometimes companies encounter this when they want to revamp or redo the website, for example, and they'll be like, oh, we need a new website. And so like the copywriter comes and says, what's your positioning? What's your messaging? Who's your audience? You're like, I don't know. Like we're just busy building the thing and trying to sell it and hadn't thought about how the specifics or the nuances of how they're going to market. So that's a really long-winded answer, Michael, but I think it's hard to do when you're in the thing. And a lot of people really benefit from having just a thought partner, honestly, to help them talk through those things. Because you do know these things, but it's really smart and strategic questions that allow you to start to articulate and to crystallize those things.
I think it's very interesting, your chemistry background. Like I did a science degree and I never really thought, like I would easily say to someone else these days, I never use my degree, right? And I've said that, I've definitely been guilty of that quite recently. And then I've started to appreciate, hang on a second, there was like an underlying piece around approaching science, around the ability to read a scientific paper and not fall asleep is a skill in itself, I think.
Yes.
The second part is to understand complex and then turn it into something. And I feel like science does a really bad job of communication, largely speaking.
Yes.
Like there's such richness when you look at academic papers, but even in really, like you can read it even like 5 times, you're like, what are you actually trying to get at? So I think there's a difference between knowing and then understanding. Yep. And then there's definitely a big gap, as you talked about, in terms of the bridge between, okay, well, I get that, but how are we going to make that? How are we going to build the communication bit over here? So I'm curious in terms of your background as a chemist, and that kind of also speaks to the chocolate thing, I want to dive in there because I feel like you can't mention that and kind of not talk about it. So, like, what have you found in terms of this journey? How's that developed for you?
Oh, I mean, it's a good point. Yes, like I spent how many years? 7 years studying chemistry, and I'm not technically using my degree. But what did I learn as a chemist? I learned to look at a problem that I had no idea about, like incredibly complex, and start to break it down. Like, okay, what are the ways that I can begin to understand this problem? What would I do? Like, what is my thinking around it? How do I test that thinking? And I mean, that's a way of thinking. Like, that's really what I learned. Like, the output was test tubes and flasks and, all lab coats and whatever. But like at the crux of it, I learned how to think about things. And so I think that really served me as I sort of bounced around trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. It was, okay, well, if I want to do this, how do I get there? And I think part of it too, in chemistry, so much is unknown. So you're just taking the next logical step. Like, you can't aim to understand, like I mentioned to you, my master's thesis was on liquid crystal materials. I mean, it's a huge field. There's no way that you start like, I'm going to be an expert in this. Like, you just take it one step at a time. How do I refine my understanding? How do I advance my understanding? And so that really informed like the chocolate expert thing, which again is not something you just go to uni for and like, oh, congratulations, you have a diploma as a chocolate expert. Like, I built that through talking to people, through my own research. I just followed my curiosity. I was really interested in chocolate, like the actual material. So not like bonbons with fillings, but like the actual chocolate, much in the way that somebody would be interested in wine, So like, wine starts from grapes, you ferment it, you turn it into wine. I'm vastly oversimplifying the field of wine, but similar principle in chocolate. And I just followed my curiosity. I liked the science of it. I liked the craft of it. I started to meet interesting people, and it turned into, okay, I have an opportunity to get involved with an awards committee. So now I'm judging competitions around the world. Oh, here's a consulting gig because somebody found me because of this. Okay, great. I'm going to do that. Oh, like, I would like to write a book. How do I write a book? Wrote a book about chocolate. And so it's really like thinking, it's learning about how to think about stuff. And it's learning about, I want to do this. I don't know how to get there. How do I get there in the most logical way? But also, I think in chemistry, in science, most of my experiments didn't work. So I would try something. No, didn't work. Okay, try this. No, didn't work. Try this. No, didn't work. And I don't think at the time I had the maturity to recognize how valuable that was. I was mostly frustrated because I just wanted to finish my degree. But in retrospect, like, knowing what doesn't work is so valuable. And I think that people discount this a lot because we focus a lot on the success. What works? Look at that person. They're so successful. They must have done really well. But like, in my experience, it's so much of it is about like, that didn't work. I don't want to do that. That's not interesting. Like, you're narrowing the aperture, I guess, of where it is you really want to go. And for me, I find so much value from that clarity.
Cool. So in terms of the chocolate, what was I going to call it? Like that kind of deep dive you've done, the tunnel, the kind of, sounds like you got really immersed in that. And even the book on chocolate. I'm just thinking about, I've never thought about this previously, but the chemistry of chocolate would be quite interesting, right?
Yeah.
And like, what gives it the flavor, the taste, the kind of the addictiveness in perhaps some regard, and also how that interacts with sugar and the impact of it all. And then I guess there would be different flavors for the French chocolate, the German chocolate, the English chocolate, the Chinese chocolate, perhaps, and then North America. Like, what, in terms of, actually, let me just pause. Is that right before I kind of speculate that is or not?
I mean, there are flavor differences culturally, for sure. There's two contributors to chocolate flavor. So one is like, where do the materials actually come from? So cacao beans are generally grown north and south of the equator. And depending on where they're from, certain regions, cacao beans will have different flavors. So that's one piece of it, is like, what is your starting material that you're working with? And then the second would be sort of the cultural, like, connotations of wherever it's produced. Like the Swiss are well known for their milk chocolate, right? And they have really high quality milk powder as well. Versus if you look at Cadbury, which is interesting because Cadbury uses milk powder from wherever the manufacturer is. So actually like UK Cadbury tastes different from American Cadbury, tastes different from Australian Cadbury because the milk powder is different. And then there's this really interesting thing where a lot of the companies want to sell into India and China just because of the size of the market, but because chocolate tends to melt, right? So playing around with different crystal structures in chocolate so that is more shelf stable and more heat stable. I mean, that's another aspect to it too. So like you have the starting material, you have the country of manufacture, and then you have the ultimate end market and what that market wants as well. Like, yeah, it's totally fascinating. And what I love about chocolate was it was an opportunity for me to exercise my interest in science. Like that's how I got into it. But I've taught workshops where people are like, actually, we're interested in sort of like the historical and socioeconomic angle. Can you do that? Can you talk about sustainability and farming practices? Can we look at this geopolitically? Like it's a fantastic entry point, I think, for exploring humanity, to be perfectly honest. And like it's been really wonderful to have different groups of people ask for those things because it gave me a lens on like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. I hadn't looked at the world or at history that way, but it really does lend itself to different ways of being interpreted.
I'm curious. I feel like there's a question here. I certainly didn't start this podcast thinking we'd end up talking about chocolate and it was going to be very much more focused on the white paper. I'm just want to kind of draw it back to a little bit, just towards the kind of bit of a summarizing. I think what's really unique about you, Igrani, is really about how you think. Not only your name, actually. I think your name's very unique, but I think it's also how you think about the world and how you think. So I'm curious how would you describe how your thinking has evolved somewhat, do you think? From your reflection, I feel like you're a deep thinker on many things. What's different about how you see the world that perhaps most people don't, do you think?
That's a hard question to answer. That's like the person who spent 20 years and, in an industry is now making something like, I think, I'm endlessly curious. So I don't think, I think one thing that's changed in my thinking is that I used to, I don't know, for lack of a better word, I was like a snob about certain things. Like certain things were, I don't know, like not worth investigating, for example. I read this book about Celine Dion, and it was about aesthetics and Celine Dion. And I mean, first of all, I'm Canadian. So like Celine is like our national treasure. Right. But I fully get it. Like she's pure cheese and pure class. And it's like, why is it so cringy and so wonderful at the same time? And this book kind of really talked about like how this person came to love Celine Dion because of everything that is Celine Dion. And it made me realize how much of a music snob I was, that there were like certain things that, that's not highbrow. That's not worth investigating. That's not intellectual. And it really challenged the way that I saw the world, because I was like, what else am I not tapping into? What am I not recognizing or learning from? Because I don't think that is intellectually worthy. And this was maybe like the early to mid 2020, somewhere between like, I want to say around like 2012. And I think since I sort of shifted that, like my curiosity has just kind of taken off. It's like, oh, what about this? Yeah. What about this? What about this? And the thing is, when you're curious about stuff and when you're sort of, as I say, promiscuous in your knowledge, you start connecting stuff that maybe like, I don't want to say shouldn't be, like is historically not connected, I want to say. And I think maybe that's it. Like, it doesn't matter. Like if it's music, it doesn't matter what genre. Like I will watch pretty much any movie unless it's a horror movie because I'm a big scaredy cat. Like I will watch good TV. I will watch bad TV. I will read old books. I will read new books. Like it's just sort of like everything is kind of a learning experience. And like, oh, this thing reminds me of this thing, which then kind of leads me over here. And then I'll read something that reinforces all of these things. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm on the right track. Okay, what is the thing to be gleaned out of this? And so it's sort of like, I don't know, constant learning but also like we were talking about that slowing down and introspection of like, okay, like there's like a spidey sense, I think, of like, okay, there's something here. There's something here. How do I put these things together? Let's just go for a walk and let's just see what happens. And it's not even actively thinking about it, but like at some point during that walk, you're like, oh, well, that thing reminds me of that thing. And that actually reminds me of this. So I don't know. It's sort of this is a very long-winded answer to your question, Michael.
No, it's a perfect answer. It's a perfect answer because like, and long-winded is fine here. Like we appreciate long-winded. Like I have a real appreciation of a long-winded because sometimes you just can't say things in a simple manner.
Yeah.
So that's quite okay. Keep going. You're doing great.
Yeah. I mean, it's endless curiosity.
Yeah.
And not constantly filling your brain. I think like I have a self-awareness of the state of my brain. And there are certain times when my brain is open to all the podcasts and all the books, and I'm going to listen to all the things. And then there's like a staticky kind of thing that happens in my brain where I'm like, oh, it's too full right now. It's too full. We need a couple of days of quiet. We need to go for a hike. We need to go for a walk. I need to just wash the dishes, hang out with my kid, whatever the thing happens to be. I need to take a break. And inevitably, a little while later, things connect. And I feel like, I honestly feel in my brain when something connects, I feel this like, there's just a little like clicking that I swear happens where I'm like, oh, that's how that thing works. Or, oh, that's how those things are connected. But you can't force it. And yeah, and I think a lot of it just comes from being, I don't know, just like not caring so much whether something is worthy of my time, if I'm interested in it, if it seems fun, and if it like gets me going, like, let's go there. Let's see what happens. If nothing happens, it's fine. But inevitably it goes somewhere.
I love it. I've just Googled promiscuous because I'm like, I've never heard the use of the word promiscuous outside of perhaps in a sexual sense.
Yeah.
And it says it's got having or characterized by transient sexual relationships is the first definition. But the second one is demonstrating or implying an unselective approach, indiscriminate or casual. And I think that one's I think unselective approach and indiscriminate is perhaps something where I think it kind of really speaks to the ethos of what we're talking about here, actually, because a lot of the people come on and say, oh, your podcast is about X. I'm like, well, not really. It's really about performance. We're very curious about performance in human beings. I think performance in humans is very interesting. And I think with you're really good at chocolate is also relates quite well in many ways to being really good in IT or philosophy or, like it can be, there's actually a lot more commonality. I'm reading a book on soccer psychology at the moment. I don't play soccer. I enjoy watching soccer, but not necessarily because I enjoy the game of like, oh, that was a really good kick, but much more from the dynamics of, this team is struggling. How do they work it out? What's going on? What's the quote unquote, the chemistry? How are they reconfiguring things? What's going on behind the scenes? That bit I'm very fascinated by. I'm fascinated by how do you perform when you've got 70,000 people, half of which are screaming at you for, because they hate you, versus the other half are like screaming at you because they love you and they think they want you to win, and then plus all the million other people who are watching and have got, vested interests and all this kind of superstar, pressure. How do you show up? How do you perform? How do you, even just kind of get out of bed in the morning when everyone's screaming at you? So that bit I'm finding relates actually really well to performance in the boardroom or performance in a leadership context or in a team meeting, or like it's actually like I'm just replacing the word soccer with like meeting, and it's just all like leading, and it's like, oh yeah, this makes complete sense. Like you could just, Control F and then replace word, and it's kind of like it kind of works actually. It's not there's a few nuances, but and I love that promiscuous thinker, promiscuous around nature, promiscuous around your intake of information. And I think if there's any lesson to take, what did you say here? You said you asked yourself the question, what else am I not looking at, or where am I being a knowledge snob almost? Yeah. And
so, but it's the other piece of it, I think, is like, because it's always a balance, is like that indiscriminate gathering, but then a very discriminating discernment of pattern and meaning out of the gathering, right? So it's I mean, a friend of mine explains this as like divergent and convergent thinking, right? So divergent, bring it all in, but then convergent, what is it that I'm supposed to get out of this? What are the patterns that I'm seeing right now? Because those patterns could be different if you looked at it from a different time, place, person, whatever it happens to be. So it's both, right? It's indiscriminate discernment, but at different times. And on
it's almost like it's like a filter. I'm not sure if you'd use that word. That's why I've just drawn a quick diagram here. Like it's kind of like all this information, but I'm trying to get it through this thing, and I kind of take out, that doesn't work. But that, and especially if you're looking for patterns, which I think is what you're alluding to, right?
Yeah, definitely. On the sports psychology and leadership, one of the best books I've read is The Inner Game of Tennis. Have you read it?
No, I've come across it.
It's about tennis. I don't play tennis. The few times I have, I've been really terrible at it, but it's actually about performance and mindset and getting out of your head and allowing sort of your default systems to take over rather than overthinking everything, which is definitely a message that I need to hear quite often.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very cool. Igrani, what a fascinating conversation. We have gone round the houses. We have covered chocolate. We've covered Celine Dion. I've never heard her on the show today. So thank you, Celine. Great to have you on here. Great to go to reference in. Look, it's been such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much. I think it's, I'm going to struggle to put a title on this one, but I think I'll ask ChatGPT for its input and see what it reckons. But it's, I think there's some real gold in here around being open to knowledge, being open to where knowledge comes from and insights from a broad range, and then allowing to distill it down into whatever sector. Because I think we can learn from many different areas, and actually you can find fresh ideas, perhaps not new, but they kind of feel fresh, which can, if you're doing something over in soccer and you apply it here in chocolate, then actually what's the link? And you can do something quite innovative, which sounds like it is the essence of what you're getting at in terms of your business, in terms of the white papers, is really trying to distill what's the story here, what's worked perhaps elsewhere and could work here. So, Igrani, thank you so much for taking the time out. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
Yes, likewise, Michael. Thank you for having me.